Yeah, well, before we dive into some of the content in your book, just a bit about your background, because not only professionally did you work and cover Russia, but you actually have family connections in Russia. What are your family ties to Russia?
Well, as I spent my whole life telling people that my mother's Russian from Kharkiv. But in fact, that's become an extremely politically incorrect thing to say because when my mother, who's still with us, was born in 1934, Kharkiv was the capital of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine, and Kharkiv remains in Ukraine, but it is a largely Russian-speaking city. So my mother's family was came from had quite a long historical connection with Ukraine, and I do go into it at some length. Not because people's family histories are intrinsically interesting. Usually, it's quite exactly the opposite. But in this particular case, with my mother's family, they are illustrative of something kind of quite important, and that is essentially two things: is an absolutely unambiguously imperial relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and also how closely intertwined that relationship is. So specifically, the first ancestor of mine that we know of went to what is today Ukraine in 1783 in the entourage of Catherine II of the Empress, and he was this guy's father had been the commander in chief of the Russian Imperial Army, and his young son accompanies the Empress on her progress through the newly kind of annexed lands of South Russia. So, I mean, it's really it's empire. Unambiguously, it's an imperial project to annex, a fundamentally alien part of what is essentially a foreign country, the Tatars of Crimea. But as for the rest of what is now Crimea, particularly like the Donbass, was actually it gets more complicated, it gets more ambiguous because you have in the west of Ukraine, a unambiguously Ukrainian speaking, homogenous, non Russian culture in the far west of Ukraine. In the east of Ukraine, you have a sort of wild, somewhat analogous to what happens a century later in America. You basically have sort of the Wild West situation. It's settled by the empress. And going forward, this guy, this guy's great nephew is my six, seven times great grandfather was governor of Kiev under Nicholas I. Uh, I'm sorry to report a famous anti-Semite and anti-Ukrainian, but
Yeah.
his job was literally to administer Kiev for the Russian Empire. So again, like it's you know generations and generations. It's a long story, but the very short version is the family of the Bibikovs is interesting because they seven generations of them live and die in Ukraine. They get back and forth to St. Petersburg. They do not in any way consider themselves to be Ukrainians. So in that sense, but nonetheless, the neither do they consider the Ukraine which they're administering, and very importantly, the last and most interesting member of this family is my grandfather, Boris Bibikov, who becomes an enthusiastic Bolshevik. And although he would hate this comparison. Essentially, what he's doing for Stalin as the builder, one of the builders of the Kharkov tractor factories, one of the major showpieces of industrialization and collectivization in 1929 to 1931 is when the Kharkov tractor factory is built. He's essentially doing the same thing for the Soviet Empire as his ancestors had done for the Russian Empire. And by the way, I should add, he gets shot in 1937 because he opposes Stalin and is horrified by the starvation that the first 5-year plan has wrought. So ultimately he ends up on the side of the angels. But while it's an imperial relationship, it's also not the same kind of imperial relationship as Britain and India. It's much more similar to England and Ireland or England and Scotland. or England and Scotland is actually a much better example, because you have throughout the 18th and 19th centuries a essentially interchangeable elite. Lots of major bureaucrats and statesmen go from Kiev to St. Petersburg and may have glittering careers in the court of Catherine II and throughout the 19th century. And the other way around, lots of Russian noblemen come to Ukraine and feel themselves, as imperial administrators, governors, Pushkin and so on. They all feel themselves completely at home. So the elites are interchangeable between Kiev and St. Petersburg without feeling that they're in a different country. Anyway, all that to say that yes, I do have a Russian, well, in fact, Ukrainian. It's complicated,
Yeah.
part of my family, but and that history is illustrative of something that's really important in my story, and that is, and it kind of what makes this war so vicious and bitter